Good afternoon, and welcome to Iran Takes a Conservative Turn. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was signed in 2015 in hopes of moving Iran's domestic and foreign policies in a moderate and reformist direction. However, while Iran completed its commitments, the United States failed to lift all sanctions, actually imposing new sanctions under different pretexts. This further emboldened JCPOA oppositionists to further undermine the JCPOA. In 2018, Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and adopted a policy of maximum pressure. While Iran continued to observe the JCPOA, the country's economy suffered, as did Iranian reformists. As a result, hardliners took control of the legislative and executive branches in the 2021 elections. While the Biden administration has been severely critical of Trump's Iran policy, they have essentially followed the same policies. Now, a more intractable conservative government in Iran is unwilling to accept American demands without getting significant and verifiable sanctions relief. Iran's future and regional outlook have become more clouded than ever before. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Shireen Hunter, who has been an honorary fellow at Georgetown University Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. She's also held positions as a visiting fellow and a visiting professor. Prior to joining ACMCU, she was at the Center for Strategic and International Studies as the director of the Islam program. A prolific author, her most recent books include Relations, Arab-Iranian Dynamics of Conflict and Cooperation, The New Geopolitics of the South Caucasus, Prospects for Regional Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, God on Our Side, Religion in International Affairs, and Iran Divided, Historic Roots of Iranian Debates in Identity, Culture, and Governance in the 21st Century. Welcome, Dr. Hunter, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Esposito. It's an honor and privilege for me to share some views and some ideas about what is happening in Iran. As I'm sure you are all very well aware, Iran in the past month or so has been experiencing a lot of turbulence created because of the death of a young woman, apparently at the hands of the Iran security forces, especially the so-called morality police, who were unhappy with her inadequate head covering. It is lately also we have heard tensions raised between Iran and the US and European countries over Iran's alleged supplying of drones to Russia, which according to some sources have been used in the war with Ukraine. And there is now talk of new sanctions on Iran, and possibly even again sending Iran's dossier to the United Nations Security Council, that if it goes there, especially under the Article 7 of the UN Charter dealing with the international security, we might expect a new United Nations sanctions also on Iran. To begin with, I have to say that it's very, very obvious that the Islamic Republic at this juncture is facing a serious and multidimensional challenge. The new generation, the generation that was born in the 2000s, is no longer seems to be sharing the religious-based ideology of the state. This is something that even some of the hardliners are admitting. But perhaps even more importantly, the economic conditions of Iran have become incredibly difficult. There are obviously some internal reasons for it, lack of adequate and competent management and corruption and so on, but there cannot be any denying that Iran, the sanctions, the US imposed sanctions, especially after Donald Trump came to power with the maximum pressure, has played a significant role in this regard. For example, at the moment, several countries, including South Korea, have blocked billions of dollars of Iranian money, which means that projects are not implemented and the country is, people are suffering, migration has increased, and so on and so forth. I think that another casualty, I would say, of this policy has been, unlike what some people, and I call them the Iran hawks, and also obviously the America hawks in Iran. I don't want to seem to just presenting a one-sided view. That's not my style. Is that they hoped that, by maximum pressure, the Iranian government and especially the supreme leader will accept all the conditions that the United States had, especially during Trump, the famous 12-point demands of the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. On the contrary, what happened actually was that the Iranian moderates who had negotiated and accepted the joint comprehensive plan of action known as JCPOA, which literally put a cap on any Iranian ability to develop nuclear weapons, lost credibility, because the supposed bargain was that Iran, in exchange for giving up a nuclear program, obviously there's some minor peaceful uses was agreed upon. That was one reason that they managed to get the agreement, that in exchange, there will be real sanction relief. Obviously, the sanction issues are to some extent in the eye of the beholder, because it was not only the nuclear-related sanctions. Iran was under sanctions for a variety of other reasons, human rights violations, terrorism things, and so on. So, for example, very symbolically, just after the JCPOA was signed and some nuclear-related sanctions like limits on the sale of Iranian oil was lifted, the Treasury imposed new sanctions. I can't now exactly remember, was it because of human rights violations or terrorism or some other such thing. Now, this obviously really undermined the moderates and certainly President Rouhani. And the hardliners really used this whole problem of what they kept calling the United States unreliability to basically to attack and discredit all the people who wanted a more flexible approach to Iran's foreign relations, and certainly a road to try to eventually improve relations with the United States. This didn't happen. And in addition to the faded hopes of economic benefits of JCPOA, there was one incident that I think that to some extent one should say, perhaps I'm exaggerating, but really sealed the fate of the more reformist, or at least I should use moderate, because some object to the term reformist. When was that? The assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So what the hardliners decided that this is it, and that this situation of, in a sort of a unofficial way of power sharing and trying to kind of go the reformist way a little bit on the foreign policy has to come to an end, and that hardliners have to gain the control of both legislative and executive power. And of course, the judiciary and the security forces were always under the control of a hardliner. So we saw that in 2020, they won the parliament in an election that actually had one of the lowest actually rates of participation. And then in 2021, they won the presidency of that. In the meanwhile, I think that, in my opinion, in a miscalculation, the Iranian government, even when Rouhani was in power, under pressure from the hardliners, tried to walk back on certain aspects of JCPOA without, however, completely ignoring it. And that was that they increased gradually the level of their uranium enrichment, and in the hopes that the Western powers, the US and European, will get worried that this might increase Iran's ability to, at some point, to produce a nuclear weapon, even though they have denied that they will do it. But again, this was a miscalculation. And the same thing happened after the new president came to power. They decided that they are going to go and talk to the Europeans and the US with a more forceful manner than the Rouhani government has done. But of course, again, there was a miscalculation. And they, in particular, I think it miscalculated the position of the Biden administration and its willingness to revive the JCPOA. President Biden, when running for presidency elections, and his spokespeople criticized very much Trump's policy of maximum pressure. They correctly pointed out that the result of the maximum pressure policy has been only that Iran has increased its level of enrichment and so has moved closer to having a nuclear weapon. I have to say that I do not agree with that. I don't think Iran is. Of course, I am no nuclear expert, and I certainly don't have any access to privileged information, so I don't want to face something tomorrow. You know, they say Iran had a nuclear explosion and I will get egg on my face. But as far as I can, any observer and analyst can and see, is that if indeed Iran was so close to having a weapon capacity, I think that the policy would have been somewhat perhaps nuanced. So I think part of the reason that they have been able to pursue this maximum pressure policy is because they know that Iran doesn't have that capacity. So let me now say that if JCPOA had put a cap on and limits on Iran's ability to enrich uranium and others, why is then that it failed, and why is then that it didn't succeed? I have to say that the problem is, and I remember actually saying that at the time, that in some ways JCPOA was dead on arrival. And the reason for that is that there were strong opposition in the United States, again from so-called Iran hawks, and also from the United States regional allies, like both Arab allies and of course Israel. to JCPOA. They thought that this particularly lifting of sanctions will increase Iran's financial resources, and that they will then divert that into what is generally being called the nefarious regional activities. And now, I am not dismissing this. This certainly is a possibility. But on the other hand, this never was actually tested. And my position always was that, reimposing sanctions is very easy. So let's say that give a year and implement JCPOA properly and see what happens. And then if Iran did do some bad things, then of course they had the so-called snapback mechanism, which would automatically bring back all the sanctions. But this was not done because I do believe that the whole nuclear thing is not the main cause of problems with Iran. I think that the issue is really the problem over the regional politics and certainly Iranian position on the Arab-Israeli conflict, and to some extent with some Persian Gulf countries, although frankly, I don't see that is much of a problem. I think that there have been relations between Iran and UAE now have sort of stabilized. Saudi Arabia once in a while keeps talking about maybe reconciling to some extent with Iran. There's of course the Yemen problem between them. But I think the main sticking point is really the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Iran, certainly the hardliners are not going to do, for instance, in the foreseeable future, what, let's say, Anwar Sadat did. Perhaps they should, I don't know, but I think that they are not going to do that. They could do it, if the power shifted. I mean, for example, if the moderates had become stronger, they might at some point do it. And in fact, at certain times, I remember that certainly Mohammad Khatami, for example, did not talk about Israel's destruction or anything, which of course is certainly no government should talk about destroying another government. But he basically said that Iran will accept whatever decision the Palestinians made. But this was not enough. And I think that there are some Iran hawks that basically would like to see a regime change, a complete regime change. I think that in 2011, as we know for sure, President Obama was pressured to attack Iran, and he wisely refused to do that. But demands for such action have not disappeared. Now, the next best thing, of course, which is to some extent what's happening now in Iran, that because of the sanctions, and again, as I say, regime's own ineptness. I mean, no country can affect any other country negatively unless certain internal conditions are ripe for such intervention. So I am not here trying to whitewash the Iranian government's shortcomings or misbehavior or problems, not at all. I'm just saying the dynamics that exist between what happens in Iran and what others respond to it. It's a dynamic process. Some people say, no, that has nothing to do with it. The Iranian regime just hates the West and it's going to go, and so it's useless to try to work out something. And they may be right. I have no clairvoyance to see. But the point I'm saying is that this mindset actually led partly to the current situation in Iran. And of course, also, I think that there has been increased, so the regime change, I believe, in the certainly last month or so with the instabilities in Iran has has gotten new supporters, and I think that perhaps some activities of certain intelligence services and so on also happening. I just, and of course they are as I mentioned at the beginning, the most important thing is the rising dissatisfaction of large segments of Iranian population with the restrictions, economic, cultural, and others that Iran is under. But you know, I once heard that a sign of an intelligent person is to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts in mind and at the same time function properly. So I think that the fact that Iran's problem have domestic roots does not exclude the fact that others may exploit this domestic vulnerabilities. So what is in store for Iran and for the region? It's very hard to say. I think that the regime is actually at the moment in a bind. They are very worried that if they liberalize certain things, for example, abolishing the compulsory hijab, for instance, that this will be seen as a sign of weakness, and then this will lead to, you know, other demands. Although some clergy actually have, in a veiled manner, said so. I mean, one of the things that, you know, I used to work on the idea of reformist Islam, as of course Professor Esposito and others have done much earlier. Was that, you know, the notion of a more liberal Islam, and two of the very senior ayatollahs in the question of hijab said this should not be compulsory, and they quoted the famous saying that la ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion or coercion in religion. This is a very important thing. But of course, these issues are not merely religious issues, they are political too. So this is one thing. And so therefore, there's a strong constituency in the country that thinks that no, any sign of weakness will be exploited, and that you can never predict what is going to happen. So what is in the works? I don't see, in fact, I remember once somebody asked me from an institute in Vienna, what was my prediction about JCPOA, and then everybody was very optimistic. I said, I don't think JCPOA will be revised. And he thought that I was a little bit too pessimistic or cynical. But so what is going to happen? I think that a lot is going to depend on how far the government will be able to stabilize the situation, and also how far the outside powers are going to try to pressure Iran to possibly exacerbate these conditions. For example, if the European Union also imposes sanctions on Iran because of the Ukraine and drone issues, certainly this is going to make the country really bad. So I think that there is a real danger, I think, in Iran of either sudden collapse of power. I don't think that this is going to be a kind of an easy thing that, you know, the regime will dismantle itself and then they'll have elections and democracy will flourish. I don't think so. This is a misreading. There will be no repeat of 1979. So what might, if indeed the situation does not stabilize, what will happen is that, you know, possibility of civil war and even some external intervention. I don't mean, you know, invasion by US or some other power, but neighboring things. For example, the Iraqi Kurdish enclave, some people operate from there in Iran, in the Republic of Azerbaijan, in Zahedan, and so on. So I think that it will be a very unstable situation, and the instabilities will extend to other parts. Of course, there's still a chance, I think, to revive the JCPOA, but I don't see the political will either in Washington or in Tehran to make really the hard decisions and pay the political price that this will require. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. And now we'll move to the Q&A part of the program.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, for coming and talking with us here at ACMCU. We do have a couple of questions. So, if anyone out there on the webinar has a question, please submit it in the Q&A, and also be mindful of the nature of questions. We want to make sure that questions are asked, not more accusations, since that doesn't help with the dialogue. So the first question we have is from Arash. Arash asks, if we expand the time horizon, can't we say that the elimination of reformist parties started from 2009, after the Green Wave movement, not after the JCPOA failure?
Well, that is a very good question and a very good point. I think that, yes, certainly, I think that that weakened the failure of the Green Movement, weakened the reform. But you also could say that this, I discuss it in my book, you could also say that at some junctures, particularly during Khatami's first presidency, some of the reformists pushed too far. I think that they really pushed too far, and consequently, they came to be seen as so-called the part of the regime changes. They in the Persian, I don't know how to translate it into English, that they wanted government to go. And Khatami later himself complained about this. But the point I'm trying to make is that Khatami's defeat, I think in 2005, or 2004, where Ahmadinejad won and became president, was in part because of the lack of response from the George Bush administration to Iran's overtures. I mean, for example, there is the famous letter 2003 that Iran offered to discuss everything, including the issues related to Hezbollah and the whole Palestinian issue and all that, but that the U.S. did not respond. In 2001, Iran cooperated with the U.S. In Afghanistan. And then immediately after that, they were called the axis of evil, member of the axis of evil. So I think that this dynamic that I referred to, the dynamic between Iran's internal politics, which is vicious, don't misunderstand me, it's vicious politics, but also the international response to certain things that is undeniable. In the nuclear agreement could have been much earlier. I remember actually I interviewed the EU, one of the EU officials for a book I was doing on this thing. There was possibility of having an agreement already in 2005, but the Bush administration openly asked that the Europeans not to do that. So the question is very correct, but what I am getting at is that the Rouhani administration, I would say, was the last chance for a kind of evolutionary reform in Iran. I'm not saying last chance, you never should say last, because hopefully there will be other chances. But by then, they were already traumatized by the impact of sanctions that started in 2008. And more severe sanctions. And I think that there was a feeling that Iranian different groups should come together and try to form a kind of a moderate center. But now I don't see that. Again, never say never again, so maybe something might happen. But yes, the questioner is correct, yes.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you everyone so much for your questions. This question is from Dr. John Vole. Dr. Vole asks, is part of the hardline Iranian approach an increase in Iranian national attitude? So is part of this hardline approach an increase in nationalist attitudes within Iran? This is the question from Dr. Vol.
You mean that the nationalism, the resurgence of nationalism? Actually, well, first of all, let me say greetings to Dr. Vol. It's nice to hear from him. So far, I don't see anything. I think that what has happened in Iran is that the whole, I'm not saying doesn't exist, but nationalism in Iran is become localized. In other words, you now have sub-nationalism, ethnic nationalism. But the younger generation in Iran, I think that they really are not attracted to any mega narratives, be it nationalist or religious or some other thing. This is one of the problems that the Iranian opposition and the protest movement has, because they really don't have a cohesive ideology to present to the people as substitute to the regime's ideology. And so, the words freedom, they're all wonderful and valuable, freedom, democracy, and so on. But that's not a blueprint. So that's why we see that every time there's a revolution, next thing that happens is internal strife and infightings. And so this is most probably what could happen. Unless, the external threats, if external threats increases, then you can find the nationalist discourse even be used by the current government. I mean, I have seen and read the comments by the Revolutionary Guards that, we are going to defend, every inch of Iran's territory and so on. So there is some element of that, and the increasing reference to Iran rather than the broader Muslim community.
So we have several other questions. We're going to try and make sure that we ask all the questions that we can. So this question is from L. L asks, instead of increasing sanctions and further hurting the impacts to Iranian citizens, is it possible to use the current situation as well as present sanctions to negotiate for social reforms for human and women's rights? And who would be in the best position to facilitate these negotiations in exchange for sanction relief?
Well, I think that is a very intelligent question, and almost, I would say, an innovative kind of suggestion. I wish somebody would pick up on that. My own feeling is that given the configuration of power within the Iranian government, and especially the role of the supreme leader and so on, I don't think that they will do any kind of negotiations that links Iran's internal development, certainly not openly. Iran's internal development with sanction relief. But I think certainly it is something that should be explored. I mean, I think that it cannot be government to government or something like that. Probably, in some think tanks, the Europeans, unless Europeans move again towards a very hard line position, which there is some indication that they might be doing, then yes, it's worthwhile. But I don't see, they are very sensitive on these things. I mean, like, you cannot say that, you abolish hijab and will ask South Korea to give you back $7 billion. That I don't think they will have. These are some of these things. These things should come from within, I think. And so that's why that when I say that both Iranians, again, I'm not a one-sided person, never has been, both Iranians and the US missed many opportunities. The US wanted everything up front. They were never willing to engage in a process Like, when Rafsanjani was in power, they reached out to American oil companies, the so-called the famous Conoco deal, that then the US walked it back. And then that was followed by certain sanctions. It's called the ISLA. And so they were never really engaged. So I think that, as I said, there was always a very strong, I would say it's actually roughly since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, there was a very strong lobby, I don't mean lobby, but a group of people, different disparate people, that basically did not want incremental change in Iran. They wanted regime change and sudden regime change.
We have several questions. This question is it's a tough one, but I think it's fair, and I think it's important to talk about.
I don't run away from tough questions. Of course, I'm in the business, so yeah.
So this question is from Daniel. Daniel asks, does the term conservative really capture the nature of the current Iranian regime? Some veteran conservatives, like Larijani, have assailed the regime's responses to the protest. Mm-hmm. Daniel agrees that the hegemony of the hardliners is partly a consequence of U.S.-Iranian relations, but ultimately, isn't the critical point that the Iranian youth population is fundamentally rejecting the premises of what is the core of the Islamic Republic? In short, can the regime give up the mission of imposing religious ideology, even if some hardline clerics say that there is no coercion going on?
That's right. Well, that is, I'm glad it's not, it's a very, very good question. Thank you, Daniel, for asking it. Well, that is the problem. To begin with, you have to realize that the various Iranian factions, let's put it that way, have gone through several stages. For example, the people that we called, reformists, certainly the leaders of the Green Movement, like Mir Hosseini Mousavi and all that, in the 1980s, they were the firebrands. Mousavi presided over the Cultural Revolution in the universities and so on and so forth. A lot of them went through a conversion in part after they lost the power struggle. So I always used to call them born-again Democrats. I doubt that any of them are really committed to the essential rules of democratic conduct, which is, peaceful transfer of power, not contesting it, and also obviously compromise. The Iranian, unfortunately, character is very maximalist. It's sort of my way or the highway. And then, of course, the moderates of the old days became conservatives. Larijani, in particular, went through a, I think, educational phase, and he became, especially after he lost various bids to presidency and so on, he became, and I think that he became much more in contact, during when he was a negotiator on the nuclear issues. They went through his education process, traveling abroad and all. So you have to realize that these are people who came from a very clerical background. They had very little contact with the outside world. The ones that had contact were with revolutionary movements in Lebanon and other places. They did not really were engaged in it. So all of them went through an educational program. This is the dilemma, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is the dilemma of, in general, an ideological system. This is what happened in the Soviet Union as well. Can a government or regime survive if it gives up its ideological principles? And this is what I think that is haunting the, I think, Supreme Leader Khamenei. Can the Islamic Republic survive if it doesn't try to impose hijab compulsorily. And my own feeling is that yes, they can if they are willing to do that. But the problem is that there are much more bread and butter issues involved. I think that if tomorrow you said, okay, women who don't want to wear hijab, they can do it. We are not going to bother them, and nobody cares about that. That might, make people happy for a while, or that, you can have all kinds of pop concerts and so on. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to, it's the bread and butter, it's the economy, and I think that is, I doubt that, let's say, given the other issues, I doubt that, let's say, the US will be willing to lift sanctions and allow Iran normal trade and economic relations just if they liberalized socially. I doubt that. The whole idea is the perception that you cannot work with this government. And as I say, yes, maybe a next leader can do that if the whole thing survives that long. If you have if Khamenei will eventually die, I think, he will be 83 in March, and already, the succession is undergoing. Who will replace him? There are some characters. I mean, for example, Khomeini's grandson, I think he's a very liberal reformist clergy and does have the family credentials and so on. And also the Revolutionary Guard might undergo some transformation. I think that we don't know, because the younger generation, all of the commanders are either in their late 60s or early 70s. And so I think that there is a generational change that's happening. But reform is not always easy, particularly in a place like Iran and a region like where Iran is, all the way from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf. Iran sits astride these things and what happens there. And then Iran's politics is now grown increasingly enmeshed in what's happening in Iraq and other places. It's just, this is one reason, I think, unfortunately, not dealing with characters like Khatami and so on earlier, and hoping that somebody else is going to do something much better and deliver on every point. I always said that the US held out for the best and ignored the good. And that is what has happened.
So we have a couple related questions. So this question here is from Benjamin. Benjamin asks, the Iranian regime, he said, clearly blundered its empowerment of the religious police in the strict enforcement of dress codes and so on. What is the likelihood that the Iranian government will quietly require the police to return to the status quo and act to further reduce discrimination against women to work and what they wear?
Oh, I think that would be the wisest thing if they could do. I think that is, they indeed miscalculated. And that is the problem also, that it could be that one stupid policeman, or, what they call it, morality police, went beyond his mandate and did what he did. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, this is the dilemma. This is the dilemma and ideological thing. My own feeling is, and that in general, the more you tighten the leash, the more rebellion is going to be. At some point, you have to allow people some sort of release. And I think this is in some ways the most, the easiest way to do it. But whether the government will do it or not. The other thing is, of course, that the current regime does not look at itself to be concerned merely with Iran. It has always a kind of a looks behind its back to see what the impact of its policies is going to be among its constituents, in the broader Muslim world and so on. And so if it dilutes its Islamic orthodoxy or whatever, will it lose its allies and so on. So the problems of the system and of the Iranian regime is very, very deep and has been going on for a long time. And of course, as I said, the way that certain issues have been dealt with has exacerbated this dilemmas, and now it is at a breaking point. One thing, however, that I have always said is people hoping for regime change, especially through turmoil and violence. And I always say that you have to be careful what you wish for. And one thing that I do know that I can say that the change will be very messy. The current government is unlikely, like the Shah, for example, to just leave and leave the country open. These guys will do whatever it takes.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that are related. So what I'm going to do is kind of summarize both questions because they're pretty related. First question is from Chris Wagner. Mm-hmm. Chris says, Dr. Hunter, what measures do you see most helpful to foster the stabilization of Iran and the surrounding region? And a related question from someone else is, in that type of effort to try and create better relationships, how can we also recognize that the degradation of Iranian relations with the U.S. has been going on for 70 years? And essentially, how can external factors influence gradual internal government change? So, related questions, but I think...
Well, I think if I may say so, I don't agree that the deterioration of relations were undergoing for 70 years. I think that that's a little exaggeration. The deterioration started with the Iranian Revolution, and I'm not going to get into elements that contributed to that, and even some aspects of U.S. policy that might have aggravated the conditions. But as I mentioned before, they were junctures that the U.S. could have tried to do something. Again, I really must add all these things. I don't believe that the U.S. is responsible for the internal problems of the countries and so on. What I am trying to basically say as an analyst of also foreign relations is that there is a dynamic interaction between the internal and the external. In other words, even today, in United States, let's say US elections, we said that the Russians were interfering or some others were interfering. So there is a dynamic interaction between the external and internal context of all kinds of foreign relations. So I think that they were in certain junctures, certain things that could have been done. This started with the Bush administration with Rafsanjani. There is a book that Gian Domenico Pico wrote called The Man Without a Gun, and he explains that how the Bush administration's unwillingness to respond positively to Rafsanjani created problems for him. And Khatami was another case in point, and then of course, Rouhani government was done. And the other thing is that Iran is also a country. It's placed in a different geographical situation, and it is obviously surrounded by other countries that have their own interests and so on. But I think that the Iran issue has also been manipulated to advance certain things. I mean, for instance, the Bush administration actively encouraged Arab-Iranian tensions or Sunni-Shia tensions after 2003 Iraqi invasion. And they had some purpose for that. The Abraham Accords partly was justifies on the basis of creating an Arab-Israeli coalition to contain Iran. I think those accords are wonderful. I think anything that helps promote peace in the region is wonderful. But I don't think that replacing one conflict with another conflict, replacing Arab-Israeli conflict with Arab-Iranian conflict is necessarily. I personally, I am a peaceable person. I think why not pursue them both simultaneously? So I think that there are a lot of things that has been done, and obviously, unless you follow these things day in and day out like I do, it's difficult to perceive the patterns.
So I think we have a related question here, and this is from an anonymous attendee. And we have time for a couple more questions. And if we have questions that can't be answered, I will absolutely share them with Dr. Hunter. So this question says, as you mentioned earlier in your talk, former President Donald Trump's stance and rhetoric as it relates to Iran seems to be a contributing factor in the chilling of diplomatic channels within the region. With U.S. political futures in question, what would be your biggest concern as it relates to the future of U.S.-Iranian relations?
I have always personally believed that in foreign policy, I am not a great believer in the role of personalities, although personalities play a very, very important role. Certainly Putin's Russia is different of something else or whatever. But I think there are some basic fundamental dynamics in every country's foreign policy that I think that persist even when the personalities in charge change. And I think that applies to US as well. But I think that nowhere this is stronger than in the case of Middle East, really. When you look at the US Middle East policy, I guess I would say since 1967 war, it's been a tremendous consistency as what has happened. My feeling is that despite all his flaws, and they were quite numerous, Trump by nature was not willing to risk war. I think that he basically, I may be misreading him, but I think that's so. We may have. I think so far President Biden has also resisted any kind of impulse that to military confrontation, but. In next elections, we might find a configuration of personalities and power equations that might be more willing to risk that, although I don't think so. But I don't believe any major breakthrough. If I were to predict what's going to be the US policy on Iran, let's say on 2023, I would say more of the same, and perhaps a little more tweaking to exacerbate internal tensions and to see what that could lead to. Either regime fundamentally alters its position. I don't think they can do that. There's some things they cannot do and survive, or that there will be some kind of a political change inside Iran.
So I think we have time for one more question, Professor. Is that okay?
Sure, of course. Whatever.
All right. So we have time for one more question. And again, if your questions were not answered, we will supply them to our featured guest. This is from an anonymous attendee. One of the issues with the JCPOA was that Iran was immediately in violation of terms. As such, this led to divided U.S. opinion regarding the JPOA as a sign of weakness on behalf of the administration who put this forward. Can the U.S. and Iran ever eventually move forward with a new JCPOA in mind of this history?
Well, I don't know what the person is saying about Iran did not comply with JCPOA, because they did. They, for example, destroyed the heavy water reactor. They reduced the centrifuges, and they obviously limited the enrichment to 3%. And but there was no. I mean, for example, in terms of economic benefits, Iran wanted to buy Boeing aircraft, quite a lot of Boeing aircraft, but there was pressure from Congress and other things, and eventually U.S. did not sell that. The U.S. also discouraged Europeans from doing that. One thing that one has to understand, that the U.S. sanctions also had a ripple effect. In other words, if you were a European company, if you know that if you traded with Iran or invested in Iran, your business in America will suffer, of course, you're not going to do it. My feeling is, to be honest with you, I think that the Iranian negotiating team, I have said this before, really dropped the ball. I think, unfortunately, the then foreign minister became overexcited that he was sitting with John Kerry and talking, and he thought that, John Kerry's word is good enough. And some of the things that they really did not pay enough attention to. So that's why I said JCPOA was dead on arrival. And so what now they are asking in general, they're saying that now it is too late. Immediately after Iran increased a little bit the level of enrichment, now everybody is saying that it is too late. Iran has gone beyond the levels, and now we cannot, JCPOA is not enough to put it within the box again, and are asking for complete stopping of any kind of enrichment inside Iran. This was one main reason why an agreement was not reached before. They want to say to extend the so-called sunset clause much more. So this is what it is. I mean, I think that President Trump also talked about new, stronger JCPOA. And if I am not wrong, don't take me to task for that. I think that some of President Biden's advisors that have also said, I have always said that the whole nuclear issue really symbolizes the other more fundamental problems in U.S.-Iran relations. And so I think that, the idea that the Iranians did not comply with JCPOA, I don't think is correct.
Okay, I think that should be about enough for questions. Professor Esposito, would you like to?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody who joined us today, but I especially want to thank Professor Hunter. I'm not surprised that she rose to the occasion. And I would strongly recommend that one take a look at the corpus of her work on Iran. It's very well worth it given the current situation. And I'm happy that you also raised the question of what's going to happen now with Iraq, with the more hardline pro-Iran folks coming into power. So that may be the subject for a future conversation. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.